Alan, can you take us through a project that you did that can demonstrate these elements? And how have you seen that in the shifts that people have made towards some kind of systemic change?
I'll tell you a little bit about one of the projects I was most happy to be part of in my role working in the Swedish government. So one thing about being a change person is that you sometimes really want to be the person who has the idea that everybody then thinks is a beautiful idea, right? You get older and you realize, actually, maybe your role is to help other people's ideas get to the fore.
That's right.
And I ended up in a position where it was definitely not my job as a very senior person in this government agency to have a lot of new ideas. My job was to approve and support the ideas that were good. That's a personal mastery issue, because if I can tell you, I've seen a lot, and it's unfortunately, again, more of a male than a female quality, that somebody else's idea suddenly becomes the top guy's idea and no credit is shared. Yeah. All right. So here's what I want to say about this story. And I'm going to send your listeners to something called the Global Investors for Sustainable Development Alliance website. Just Google GISD Alliance. And what you'll find is an extraordinary initiative that was promoted by a lot of really wonderful people, some of them working for me, some of them working in the UN, some of them working in private business, that developed a global network of very top senior people in 30 of the world's most important investment firms to promote the idea of sustainable investment, with the Secretary General of the United Nations as the convener. How did that happen? When I arrived in my job, I saw that some of my colleagues were working on a really important idea, and I said, that's the idea, go, and I'll try to help you. And I used my experience and things to try to pave the way for this idea. But all the work was done by other people. I just watched and nodded and said, hooray. The second thing, it's the mixture of all these personal relationships, building trust between the chief investment officer of company X and UN official A, and they have to get to know each other. They have to trust each other. It's personal, but it's also institutional, and it has to work in institutional terms. That's tricky. And then the thing about fulfillment and sacrifice, sometimes you just got to burn the extra midnight oil. You got to make the extra trip. These were big sacrifices, but in this case, you sometimes just have to put personal interests aside to make something work. And I watched a lot of people in the UN system, in the government systems, in the company systems, just stretch their personal capacities and their personal capital to the limit to get this idea in place. So has it changed the world? Yeah. But has it transformed it utterly and financed all of our sustainability dreams? No. But it has definitely put a huge new sort of edifice in the system. And it's from that combination of people working with passion at the individual level, but negotiating institutionally and community-wise, and making the personal sacrifices required to do it.
How long ago was that?
The launch date was, I think, 2019 officially.
Oh, wow.
And if people go to my website, they'll find my recent keynote speech at an academic conference here in Europe, where I said, 30 years ago, I made this kind of joke in another speech that, if we succeed in our sustainability visions, the result is going to be a bureaucracy. And that is in fact the case. Now we have here in Europe, we have these fantastic laws, and all over the world there are codes and guidelines, and the UN itself, of course, and even scientific publications are themselves bureaucracies. But this GISD Alliance is part of that, you might say, global bureaucracy. So it's almost invisible to most people. And most sustainability is invisible and somewhat bureaucratic. So what I love about what you're doing with this podcast, with the conference, and will do for the global community of people who care about these issues, is to bring the bureaucracy and the personal passion back together, because we need that in order for these things to work.
That's such an interesting perspective, because I think it's almost like fulfillment and the personal peace, right? And freedom, right? And somehow bureaucracy and having structures seems a confinement or seems a restriction. How do we reconcile with that?
You went right to the heart of things here, Poorani, with that question. I'll back up a little bit and say that when working with people who want to work on sustainability and systems change, et cetera, one of the first pieces of advice I have, or questions I like to pose, is, where do you want to be in the system? Where are you most effectively deployed as a resource? Where are you happiest? And if you're happy being an activist on the front lines with a placard because that's who you are, then do that. But listen, if you have the skill to move into the system, suppress your desire to shout at everybody and work diplomatically to kind of over the course of a year or 4, move an idea forward, then that's where you should be. And so for me, it's important that we just have clarity about where it is we are in the system. And so I discovered some years ago that while I enjoyed being out in the woods and chanting and staying up all night around a fire, which I sometimes did secretly while I was consulting to the big companies, but I also enjoyed putting on my suit and working with a lot of people in an institutional setting and saying, okay, but we know this is a good idea. We know it's not quite ready for prime time yet, but what can we do to move it forward? How can we polish it off so that it looks, less radical? Those kinds of conversations were always very interesting. If people are able and willing to make that journey, then I also encourage them to do that, because the bureaucracy part of sustainability isn't always the most fun. Sometimes if where you want to be is at the party, then you're the party person. And I've been in that role too, where you're the facilitator and you're the workshop leader and you're this rock star. That's fun. And maybe that's where you should be. But sometimes we also need people who can put that need aside and move into that quieter, systemic, institutional process. So for me, that was also a kind of an aha. I'd been standing on stages and singing songs about sustainability and all kinds of things for years. And I got my middle 50s and said, maybe it's time to do something else. And that's when I moved into a government role. It wasn't just something I could just pick up and do, but I sought my way into that kind of role. That's my story.
Well, I just want to follow up on that piece, right? So it's almost like it's part of the mastery journey in a way, right? That we're not pick that role and that's showing up or emerging for us to step into. And the question is first, are we cognizant of that's happening? And then are we ready or willing? I think that's the part of sacrifice you're speaking of, right? That are we ready to let go of the comfort or the known space to move into the new space that's really calling us now?
Absolutely. I won't name this person, but I saw a dear colleague who had passed away. Not somebody I knew personally, just somebody I admired. And there were pictures of this person over time, a man. In his most recent pictures, he was in his suit, bald in fact. But in his early pictures, he was a hippie. He had clearly made this journey that not everybody needs to make that journey. That's not what I'm saying either. I don't think you're saying that. But it is about being very conscious and intentional where you're good and making the adjustments that also happen over time. We change over time and the times change us.
Exactly. Yeah.